Hi, Alan. Hi, how are you?
Yeah, not too bad, thank you. Yeah, how are you?
I'm good. I'm good. I managed to get one of your recent books. What's the book called?
Deny and disavow. Yeah.
Yeah. When I was reading your book, I mean, you talked about your personal kind of understanding about history, and you talked about you're not like a radical Marxist, you are not a CRT person, or you are not like things we talk about these days about the culture war and all those things.
Yeah.
What I am planning to do is like talk to a historian, proper historian. So,
Yeah.
like one of my history colleagues was saying that if you want to know about history, talk with the historian.
Yeah. Yeah.
And one thing I saw when I was like following your tweet, I mean, you wrote a review on someone's book called this is like Nigel Bigger, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah. His book Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning. Yeah.
But he's not a historian.
No, he's a theologian. That's right. I wrote a brief review which was published in on Bella Caledonia, an internet source. But I've also written a much more extensive review, which is just about to go online with the Journal of Imperial and Commonwealth History.
Just wondering this, you feel like obliged to write back to these people because these people are not historian at all. Do you think
No.
it's just no use? Because I mean, he will say whatever he needs to say.
Yeah, yeah. I think the reason why I feel obliged to write back is because regardless of whatever actual historians do, he is he's got a platform. That platform is getting ever bigger, and he's gaining more traction by writing stuff that is basically denialist about
Mm,
the British Empire. And it may be totally ineffective for us historians to write back and say, well, actually, you're writing in ignorance of the evidence, in ignorance of the historiography. You're writing from a purely political perspective. You know, those arguments may not wash with the vast majority of his followers who
mm,
like what he writes because of their politics rather than because
mm,
they're interested in history. But I think it's worth doing so because the
mm,
other option is just to leave it unchallenged. You know, if you
mm,
don't
mm,
challenge it, it doesn't go away. It doesn't disappear. It just goes
mm,
unchallenged.
mm,
So you hope that you might be able to reach at least a few of his readers, people who don't know much about colonialism. We were never taught it very much in our schools, but people who are susceptible to evidence and expertise and reason, and that you
mm,
hope you may be able to change some minds, even if you
mm,
can't change the vast majority. But it just seems to me worthwhile to do it. No matter how little the impact is, just to try and have some impact rather than let it go completely uncontested in the public
mm,
sphere and totally distort the public's understanding of history, which is
mm,
what I think is happening.
mm.
Yeah.
They are in full force to tell the history, but they're
Yeah.
not historian.
No, that's right. And then their platform derives solely from their conservative politics. You know, the fact they
Mm,
have a platform is dependent on the Telegraph, the Times, the Daily Mail,
mm,
GB News. You know, these are the outlets which promote them as if they were historians and as if they are giving an
mm,
objective view of the imperial
mm,
past. And that's what I find so concerning as an academic historian who's
mm,
worked on this for 30 odd years, and
mm,
not me alone, you know, many of my colleagues too, have produced very richly researched, nuanced, evidence-based discussions of empire and colonialism. And it's not those that are gripping the public's imagination. It's those with a kind of political perspective on empire who aren't interested in understanding or explanation or a holistic account.
mm,
They're solely interested in fighting a culture war against the supposed woke takeover, as they see it, of the country. But the difficulty is if you are in good faith trying to write about the empire, trying to research
mm,
and write about it, you simply can't avoid the fact that colonialism, modern European colonialism, was racist and it was violent. It involved the violent conquest of lands.
mm,
Very, very few colonies voluntarily acceded to the empire. You know, all of them, virtually all of them, were conquered at one stage or another and sought to retain their independence and their sovereignty. So violence cuts through colonialism in very obvious ways. It's pretty obvious to most people. People generally don't like being colonized by alien outsiders and having their sovereignty stripped away from them. And yet there's a kind of current of denial about that violence. And it's also startlingly obvious from the European empires that every single colonial society was governed according to a racial hierarchy. You know, that whites were at the top of that hierarchy. even if it wasn't legally encoded in racist terms, everyday practice meant that there was a racialized social hierarchy. And denying that seems to be utterly absurd. And yet that denial seems to be gaining ground because of this right-wing culture war-driven promotion of this cherry-picked version of history.
I mean, before digging into those like more complex areas, what are those keywords about, this like that use like culture war, like, cancel culture, snowflakes, oak? I mean, what does it mean? Like sometimes I get like confused, like which one is me? I mean,
Yeah, and the hypocrisy with which they're wielded is amazing sometimes as well. So people who get deeply offended by the fact that someone says something critical about the empire, take it very personally, and they accuse the other person of being a snowflake. You could argue, well, haven't you got the emotional strength to put up with some critique of what Britons did in the past without getting deeply offended? So there's a great amount of hypocrisy in the flinging of these accusations, but. Yeah, I think they a lot of it derives from the other side of the Atlantic, from across in the USA. And the culture war was invented to refer to a shift in US politics after the 1960s. The secularization of society, progressive changes in civil rights, in women's rights, the resistance, the backlash to that, and the origins of culture war are to be found in that conservative backlash against these progressive social changes. And I think what's added to that is the post-2008 financial crisis, the fact that you have a constituency that feels left behind, that feels marginalized by these sort of cosmopolitan liberal elites that caused the crisis, and that whose wealth and fortune hasn't really suffered as a result of it, and yet theirs has. So you've got this sort of ready-made constituency for culture warriors to try to access and appeal to by scapegoating the woke, scapegoating immigrants, scapegoating anti-racist campaigners, and so on for their woes. So that sort of blending of a post-1960s binary approach to the world that comes from US conservatism. And the post-2008 banking crisis making it more of an electoral gambit to try and gain a constituency using these culture war terms. I think it's led to a very potent and quite dangerous mixture at the moment, this rise of populist, national conservatism as a movement.
Like, I think one of the things you mentioned in your book that, I mean, there is a like sense of like anxieties with this like ruling class, that there is a chance for retribution who were oppressed in the past, and then like obviously the demography is changing, so lots of anxieties happening in like especially in America. I think UK society is much more entrenched with this ruling class in charge. What's your take on those things, like that kind of anxieties? I mean, how real those anxieties are, or it's just like it's like historical problem?
Yeah, I think there's a range of anxieties that are greater or lesser among different constituencies. So I think we have to disaggregate the ruling class as one starting point. So part of the ruling class would be more liberal in its disposition, and would align with exactly what populists are critiquing, the kind of cosmopolitan neoliberal approach to global governance, to financial flows, more sort of free market orientated. And you can actually see these splits within the current Conservative Party. There is a wing which is less culture war driven, more driven by the need to regenerate global economic growth and line their own pockets to a certain extent as well. But then there is another group which is much more nationalist and populist in its orientation, more driven towards autarky as the goal rather than a globalized economy. And they're as much part of the elites, the ruling classes, as the sort of liberally orientated, capitalist aligned groups. So there's tensions within these classes. But what gives the kind of the populist nationalists who are trying to pursue sort of nationalist autonomy and autarky again the edge at the moment, I think, is this kind of a constituency of relatively poor people who've done badly out of globalization, who've done badly out of the financial crisis since 2008. who've done badly out of Brexit as well. But it's the Brexiteers, ironically enough, who are trying to capture that constituency by selling them culture war. By saying your enemies actually are people coming across the channel on small boats. They're the ones who are to blame for potholes in the roads and NHS waiting lists and not being able to see your GP and so on. So there are splits within the ruling class about what needs to be done and how to do it. As I say, the Conservative Party sort of demonstrates these splits very nicely, and culture war is a particular electoral strategy that certain groups within the party, like Suella Braverman, for instance, are really trying to push home. And we've got this National Conservatism Conference going on at the moment in London, which brings together those kind of elements. Started in the USA, it's the kind of alt-right, pro-Trump, the irony of this massively rich billionaire telling people you've been left behind by the global economy. Let's make America great again by backing me, and aligning with ordinary people as if he's one of them. And you've got that going on within the Conservative Party, but you've also got much more traditional Conservatives who balk at the xenophobia, the racism, the populism and the nationalism manifested in by that wing of the party. And it's one of the things that's tearing the party apart. Now that whether or not to leave the EU is not the divisive issue, its successor is this, whether to be populist, nationalist, hierarchical, or whether to cohere to more traditional sort of conservative values of neoliberal economic management and a sort of laissez-faire approach. So that those tensions are very much within the ruling classes, and they are present throughout society as obviously as well.
But I mean, it seems like they were very successful. I mean, they are successful in this kind of endeavor. I mean, look at Trump's win, and still if you talk about America's politics, it's 50-50 divide. So Trump can still win. So they tapped really well to that constituency, and they really believed their rhetoric and their understanding about history. Same with UK, with the Brexit and other things happening. So the Conservatives are the most successful political party in UK's political history. So
unfortunately, you're right. It has been very successful, and I think that's why there is this wing of the party that is so dedicated to resurrecting Boris Johnson and that kind of populist politics with which he was associated, the culture war stuff. But I think what interests me most as an historian of the British Empire really is the inflection on this, on the British side of the Atlantic, that came through Britain's role as a major imperial power. The US has always had an ambivalent relationship with imperialism. It declares itself anti-imperialist because its birth as a nation came in its rejection of imperial rule. But on the other hand, it's clearly acted akin to an empire in many ways ever since, an empire in its own right. But in Britain, there's no getting around it. Britain was a major imperial power, and being an imperial power has infused the very notion of Britishness. Britishness is a coalition of English, Welsh, Scots, and Northern Irish, and Irish to a certain extent, joining together to colonize other parts of the world and forging a sort of common identity, a unity in difference through that project. It's much more intrinsic to Britishness. And I think that's one of the reasons why it features more in the culture wars here than in the USA. And particularly, I think the spark for a colonial culture war here, a culture war over colonialism, came with the Black Lives Matter protesters targeting Edward Colston's statue in Bristol. That was a way of bringing home very clearly the continuities between the treatment of enslaved African people and the racial disparities that still characterize Britain. Those continuities are not obvious and not clear cut. There's no linear path, but it's obvious that you can't understand racial disparities today without some reference, at least, to the practices of slavery and colonialism elsewhere. So by attacking Colston, they sort of drew empire into the narrative of the culture war, and the government's reaction was very telling. An immediate backlash that we must protect our statues. Oliver Dowden, the culture secretary at the time, talked about protecting our statues from the woke militants who want to tear them down. And as soon as that statement came out, you knew, okay, this is going to be a focus for culture war in Britain, how we remember the imperial past, how we remember colonialism. And you kind of knew that the denial of colonialism's intrinsic violence and racism would be a key platform for right-wing culture warriors here. There's something that they could smear their supposedly woke left-wing enemies with. There's this sort of constant attention to racism and violence and denial of anything good the empire did. So all these stereotypes about what the academic literature says started to be reproduced. And those allegations about woke history bear no relationship to the history itself. Most of these commentators simply haven't read the vast majority of what historians have written about empire, but they dismiss it as woke and anti-British anyway.
Like, I think we kind of progressing too quickly. I think I need to go back to your your journey as a historian. But before that,
yeah, sure.
Do you mind telling us about a bit of your background? I mean, where you were born and raised?
Yeah, so I was born in Haringey in North London at a time when there was a large number of Cypriot immigrants due to the conflict in Cyprus, and immigrants from the Caribbean as well. And I was part of a white, largely working class community, many of whom felt threatened by what they saw as a kind of alien invasion and the change to the appearance of their streets, with Cypriot-run stores spilling out onto the pavement, selling produce in a way that English store owners hadn't done before. So it was in the midst of these anxieties about immigration and race. And my family moved out to Enfield, moved a bit further out towards the suburbs, partly as a result of fear that my education would be diluted somehow by the fact that there were speakers coming in of English as a second language. That some of these kids who were arriving in the area would hold my education back in some way. So we moved out to Enfield, and I grew up with the kind of common views about race and immigration and difference of a lot of white working class people, I think. When I started to read comics and things, as I got into 8, 9, 10 years old, the comics were very part of a very established genre in which Britishness was associated with standing alone in the Second World War against Nazism, something that you still see very much on the sort of right wing of the culture war, and the nostalgic view of what Britishness is and British history. And if it wasn't about the Second World War, much of it was about empire. It was about thin red-coated lines of soldiers holding back savage hordes, and defending themselves. So there's no sense really of why those red-coated soldiers were in places like South Africa, for instance. And one of the things that really struck me as a kid was watching the film Zulu. And it was a sort of formative experience for me, which recognised the heroism of Zulu warriors, but was largely focused on the defence of this outpost, Rorke's Drift, by these brave British soldiers, and it really instilled a sense of sort of British pride, national pride. And it wasn't until a few years later that I started to wonder why those soldiers were in Zululand in the first place, and that was really my point of entry into colonial and imperial history. So as an undergraduate, I was fortunate enough to get into Cambridge, and the first generation, along with my brother in my family, to go to university. And I had the chance of getting a travel bursary to go somewhere and do my dissertation. I did geography as a degree, and part of it was to write a dissertation. And I applied for some funds from a college bursary and managed to go to South Africa, with the intention of finding out a bit more basically about Zulu history, the history of the Zulu kingdom, and ultimately why it was that there was this confrontation as represented in the film Zulu. So I started to read about the policies of confederation, which the Colonial Office was driving, and which led to a series of wars, aggressive wars launched by Britain to try and conquer each of the independent African polities still remaining in South Africa in the 1870s, bring them under one united British government, and also ultimately to conquer the Boer republics, which would add later to the Anglo-Boer War, the South African War. So I started to get immersed in the more accurate and more sort of nuanced history of colonialism, rather than these sort of patriotic representations of what the empire meant. And I think this is one of the reasons why I understand how difficult it is to shift, to budge some of these sort of dominant views of Britishness and empire. We weren't told an alternative story. It seems strange to me that even today, when things are changing, most history curricula pay more attention to the Tudors than to colonialism. And the Tudors were important, fair enough. I'm not trying to diminish the importance of my early modern colleagues, but they were around for about 100 years, about 400 years ago. Whereas Britain was a major player in the reconfiguration of the globe as a whole over a 400-year period. And some would argue it still hasn't ended, but formally imperialism ended only almost in our lifetime, certainly in our parents' lifetimes. So we don't learn about this stuff from any more impartial perspective. And I suppose for the last 30 years, that's what I've been engaged in, is learning myself about what colonialism was and what it meant for those who were colonized, rather than just for Britons at home. And that's what led me onto my career path.
I mean, especially a bit of my story is I was born in Bangladesh, and first off, 50% of my life I spent there and 50% here. So my growing up in Bangladesh, I went to school, even in the primary school, we taught about colonial history. So the colonial history is part and parcel of our growing up, and the violence and the things perpetrated against us. It's been written in the books, textbooks, in the plays, in the novels, fictions, dramas, TV shows. Everything is part and parcel of our growing up. When I came here, and then I've got 2 young children, and they went to school, and they've got no idea. I mean, there's a history, actually, something happened in Bangladesh, and especially Bengal was seriously, destroyed by British Empire. So my story is totally different than their understanding about empire. So there's a huge blind spot in their understanding about what Britain is today. And when I came here, and then I did my PhD, and during that time, suddenly my university decided to give one of the teaching buildings name is Dalhousie building. So Dalhousie, so this is so Dalhousie dynasty. So we taught about Lord Dalhousie, So this Dalhousie is not the same Dalhousie, but he's also a colonial, governor general, not in India, but somewhere else in Africa, and worked under one of the vicious white supremacist, prime minister. But you can see how these people are extremely well respected, well revered. My story is whenever I go to that building, each time I go there, the memory comes back. So for me, it stays there. But here, the memory is different story. I'm not sure whether it creates so much stress for me when I go to the building. And over the years, through our union, I actually, led a campaign to change the building's name. But it went nowhere.
Right. Yeah.
But you can see, these things happen here very casual way.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think that, as you mentioned in the case of your upbringing, it's not just what you're taught formally in school. It's part of that sort of immersive culture of TV, radio, novels, and so on. And it's only relatively recently that we've had more insight in this country into the experiences of colonized peoples and other views of empire than the kind of patriotic Britain was the greatest, and Britain brought civilization and education and peace to the world. And I think that's partly why we're seeing such a vicious backlash, because it is quite new still, that kind of confrontation with the realities of the colonial past. We're used to a diet of films and TV programs about empire which look through rosy, rose-tinted, nostalgic eyes at it. And just the vehemence of the reaction against anything which challenges this sort of complacent, nostalgic view is sometimes quite astonishing. I'm thinking of Satnam Sangera's best-selling Empire Land, which is quite mild. If you read it with anything like detachment, or as close to detachment as you can get, it's a very sort of mild and moderate sort of stock take of ways in which we might see things a little bit differently if we see Britain as infused by these colonial relationships in the past. And yet the vicious reaction against it, he's had racist abuse, he's been trolled, he's been threatened. And people like David Olusoga as well, who are trying to sort of gently challenge some of these dominant narratives around Britain and its colonial past. and the abuse with which they're met, it shows you how deep this kind of reservoir of resentment against any retelling of our history is. And as I say, through my own sort of background, I can understand that it's psychologically challenging when you've associated part of your own identity, your self-identity, with the kind of group identity of Britishness. And when you've been told all through your life that Britishness is something positively celebrated in the rest of the world because of what we generously gave the rest of the world through our empire, to have that sort of thrown back at you and say, well, actually, you've been sold a bit of a lie. Of course, there are people who are nostalgic about the empire in places like Hong Kong, in Nigeria, in any former colony. Colonialism wasn't a simple binary black and white issue. Colonial rule relied on co-optation, collaboration, accommodation. These things were extremely complex, but nevertheless, it was fundamentally a white supremacist project. Whoever elevated certain indigenous elites and collaborators could be, they were never quite white, as part of Chatterjee puts it. They could never be right at the very top of any colonial system. And it relied on an enormous amount of violence. And, but even saying those two things, which seem patently obvious for any form of colonial expansion in history, that it relies on inside or outsider status of some kind, happens to be racialized in the modern empires, not necessarily so in older empires, and it relies on violence. Even that is challenging. Hearing that is challenging, and leads to these kind of psychological, almost innate unconscious strategies of deflection, the kind of whataboutery. That it wasn't just us, and we weren't as bad as the Nazis, and things like that. There are ways of avoiding engagement with psychologically challenging aspects of our past, I think.
I mean, like, it's like a passing comment. One of my former colleagues, I mean, he died a couple of years ago. I mean, bless him. I mean, he was quite a funny guy, but he has got this casual approach about, empire or, colonies and all those things. I mean, he always tend to taunt me that, colonies, why do you care much? Because we were also colonized by the Romans, no? We don't talk much about those things.
It's like the kind of Monty Python, what did the Romans ever do for us kind of thing, is what it's reverted to. And even at the time in the early 19th century, colonial philanthropists and humanitarians who objected to the brutality of settlers, for instance, in a number of colonies, said we should be more like the Romans, that colonialism isn't necessarily a bad thing. There was a guy called Sax Bannister, who was the Attorney General of New South Wales, and who actually confronted the morality of colonialism and said, if we were just colonizing people's lands, taking their resources, dispossessing them, and it was doing them no good, then we should stop doing it. But it didn't end there. We went on to say, however, the Romans have shown us that colonialism can be good. That's obviously partly that's because we're looking now back on it thousands of years later. We're not still living with the kind of social hierarchies that Romans imposed in the way that we are with modern colonialism's racial hierarchies. And it's also partly because we've kind of written out of our popular narratives all of the conquest and the suffering and the exploitation that the Roman Empire involved. We're left with villas and roads and a few sort of relics like that. But those kinds of insights don't get made. It's just used as a general sort of get out for colonialism can be a good thing.
Like, I mean, it's not like, very uncommon, even in the academia. Like I met people in the academia, I mean, who tend to talk about colonies as, they did bad things, but also, they did lots of good things as well. And sometimes I told them that this is quite hurtful for me, talk this way. I mean, like this like discourse about, we're also benevolent, ruler. I mean, my ancestors did not have that kind of understanding about benevolent ruler in their lifetimes.
You often see this ridiculously simplistic balance sheet approach. We did bad things, we did good things, but overall the good outweigh the bad. And it's so nonsensical to historians, or probably to any scholar, because obviously we have to talk about good things for whom. bad things for whom? It's not as if the empire was a net good or a net bad. It did good things for most white Britons, even relatively poor working class Britons who were exploited horrendously in terms of class within Britain, could emigrate as a settler and suddenly be elevated to the top of the social pecking order by virtue of their whiteness. So it did good things for most Britons. It generated capital for investment, industrialization, for instance. We don't know how much capital from slavery, slave ownership, compensation money paid to slave owners. We don't know how much that spurred industrialization, but it certainly played a role. And some of the major compensation beneficiaries, former slave owners, reinvested in industrialization, railways, and so on. So we know that it did good things. We know that it did good things in the colonies for certain colonized peoples too. It did bring healthcare, it did bring education, it did bring roads, eventually access to railways, all in racially discriminatory ways, very largely. But some people benefited from it. But of course, the majority of colonized peoples probably, we would never be able to ascertain with questionnaires or surveys or anything now, but probably the majority of colonized peoples felt disadvantaged by land loss, by racially discriminatory law, discrimination in the judicial system, by having to pay everyday deference on an everyday basis to white people, to call them Saab or whatever when they came past, and to show appropriate deference or be punished for it. So those kinds of everyday aspects of racialized rule don't tend to appear in these balance sheets. And my argument is that we should eject the whole idea of balance sheets and look in nuanced ways at the way that colonialism operated differentially for different groups of people in different places at different times.
I mean, I was reading some stuff. When I was growing up in Bangladesh, one of the things we learned about East India Company is always, kind of stayed with me, East India Company. One of the fascinating stories is East India Company raised a kind of military force, which is around 200,000. That's a private company raised 200,000 soldiers.
Yeah.
Unbelievable story, and then which is linked with my, I teach a bit of Middle East politics from IR perspective, and I bring Edward Said and a couple of other people in our understanding about, this post-colonial discourse or Orientalism. If you talk about the Enlightenment thinkers here, people like James Mill, like John Stuart Mill's father, who actually used to work for East India Company, and he was paid £2 million today's money a year. But also you can see this Enlightenment philosopher, very respected, well respected here. He wrote, I think, 6 volumes on India. He never been to India.
That's right. Yeah.
And then he talked about India, basically, his archive was, the way you historian, went to those archive and did all those forensic things. His archive was basically East India Company's archive.
Yeah.
Another fascinating story about James Mill is, his books are not actually, about India, it's against India. How bad the people are, the culture, the religion, the weather, the mosquitoes. He portrayed a very, dystopian world there. So I think people like Edward Said mentioned that, these writings are not innocent, because this will be taught, because he's a famous writer, he's a famous philosopher, will be taught in major universities in the UK during that time. And these people can be actually posted in colonial setting as a civil servant with that kind of view about those people.
Yeah.
So so it's a part of, so that's why the violence is so easy in the colonial setting, because they're not dealing with actually human beings. These are humans.
Yeah, that's right. And you're exactly right. And again, that feeds into why there was this major rebellion in 1857, and why it wasn't just soldiers. Soldiers may have kick-started the rebellion with their mutiny, but then it spread into a much wider rebellion. And it is partly because you've got this new generation of civil servants trained in East India Company College at Haileybury in England, trained in the works of Mill, John Stuart and James Mill, and trying to implement these kind of ideas of political economy in a context in India where they're convinced, and they've been convinced by those writings, that they're in amongst a load of savages who are superstitious, who don't understand how modern bureaucracy and governance works. So they start to impose taxes, and it's John Wilson writes about this in his book, India Conquered, that part of the grievance of many Indian peasants wasn't so much that they had to pay taxes. They were used to paying taxes to various authorities back through time. It was partly the way that those taxes were collected, as well as their increasing rate under company rule. So when, for instance, local tax collectors in the past, under Mughal rule, had waived taxes for temples or for holy men or for particularly respected figures, that wasn't a form of corruption. But these people coming out from Britain, trained in political economy, saw this as just simply corruption. But it wasn't. It was just a way of assimilating tax raising into local customs and habits and practices. And when in the past, local taxes might have been flexible if a family was struggling, waived tax for that year, reduced tax for that year, and reimposed it the following year. There was no such flexibility in this rigid British administrative system. So it's as much about this sort of imposition of an alien way of doing things based on a complete misunderstanding of Indian society. That was one of the reasons why, when the mutiny occurred, many peasants saw an opportunity to join the rebellion against British rule. And that contempt that you're speaking about, that runs through some of those liberal writings on India, was, I think, a key part, played a key part in the imposition of these alien ways of doing things and lack of flexibility. You can see that throughout most of the 19th and the 20th century. But it's a mistake to take that as the reality. It is a rhetoric. As you say, Mill's rhetoric was derived from the East India Company's own self-justificatory reports. And even when those attempts at civilization, as the British saw it, were implemented, they were largely implemented in the interests of British investors rather than Indians themselves. And going back to that, the family name, Dalhousie, as you know, Governor General Dalhousie was primarily responsible for the kickstart to India's railway program. Yeah. But he was quite open about it. It wasn't for the benefit of Indians. It was for the benefit of extracting coal and other resources and bringing British textiles into India. It's for the benefit of British investors. And the costs of railway building were actually underwritten by a guarantee that would be derived from Indian taxation and the taxation of Indians. The fact that later on railways brought some benefits in famine alleviation was neither here nor there to his original thinking in the planning for them. And that was so often the case, that these sort of civilizing intentions articulated at the center of empire were always subverted in some way in practice. So, around the beginning of the 20th century, the Colonial Office had a strict policy of non-racial laws. Laws in the colonies shouldn't explicitly discriminate on the grounds of race. So instead, they implicitly discriminated on the grounds of race with things like language tests being used to make sure that immigrants were only white, only English speaking as a first language, for example, and all sorts of other subtle sort of qualifications, which meant that the legal system was stacked against people of colour and in favour of white people. So every colony was characterised by these forms of discrimination, regardless of the rhetoric of non-racialism at the centre.
I mean, especially like Lord Dalhousie, though he left before the Sepoy Mutiny in 1857, but the things he did previously, like up to 56.
1856 and 1857.
Yeah. So I mean, his like expansionist idea, like all those vicious, like oppressive ideas, actually triggered all those things. When he left, it's in a kind of boiling point.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Dalhousie was one of the major causes of the uprising in 1857. He was so intent on this program of British expansion and control of India as a site for British investment, British growth, and incidentally, he thought in some foreseeable future bringing civilization to Indians. He engaged on this sort of frenzy of annexing formerly independent princely states, bringing them under direct British rule, even though there'd been a kind of roughly balanced way of governing India for some decades before that, where a number of Indian princely rulers agreed to govern with British oversight, but with sort of a degree of autonomy and independence within their kingdoms. And some of them were even investors in the East India Company. Some of them even had shares in the companies with these Indian rulers. But he upset all of that sort of relatively delicately negotiated balance of power with this, intention to, this sort of hubristic intention to bring what Britain could do to India to transform it.
Mm.
Much of that involved alienating the sepoys, the Indian armies of the company, who until then had felt that they were relatively well respected by their British officers. So things like the company had refrained too much anyway from sending them overseas, realizing that a trip overseas could complicate caste relationships, caste standing for some of the Hindu soldiers, for instance. They paid them more when they served outside the presidency in which they were recruited. And again, there'd been a sort of relatively negotiated arrangement, but it was the kind of arrogance of believing that such kind of accommodation was no longer needed, that these were just sepoys at the disposal of the British Army, and this increasing social distance between white officers and Indian sepoys that provided some of the backdrop for the uprising. So most people in Britain see it as purely a mutiny of soldiers enraged by the fact that the new cartridges they had to use in their guns, had pig fat and cow fat in them. But that was clearly the kind of just the final trigger, which indicated a complete loss of trust in anything that they were told by their white commanders. And that loss of trust had been building up through years of overthrowing princely states and treating the army with increasing contempt. And it wasn't as if the British weren't aware of this. Indians had been writing about this, complaining about this for a long time. And one of the other things that sort of strikes me about it is these sort of British liberal views of people like Mill. It wasn't as if liberalism that they articulated was rejected by Indians. That there was a strong middle class, well-educated Indians who saw the value in liberalism, who liked these ideas and who wanted to implement them in India, saw them as progressive, but they became steadily disillusioned through the late 19th century as they realized that it wasn't education or acculturation or attainment that determined whether they could get involved in implementing those ideas. It was simply whiteness. Their lack of whiteness was what would keep them out of exercising any form of liberal governance. So that disillusionment in turn sparked the rise of nationalist movements in India, in South Africa, and elsewhere. But again, most British people don't appreciate, because we're not taught, how hypocritical these ideas became once they were projected outside Britain and into the empire. Ideas of democracy, for instance. The assertion that the empire brought democracy is absolutely absurd. It spread the idea that democracy would be a good thing, but then it denied it to people on the grounds of race. Hence nationalist movements and anti-colonial movements.
Like, I'm kind of aware of time, so I really want to touch like the King Charles's coronation a bit. So when you wrote your book, Deny and Disavow, if you were writing this book now, would you do a chapter on like the coronation?
Well, as it happened, I've just done a second edition of Deny and Disavow, which should be, which is I think is available now even. But it was written just before the coronation, so it updates to a certain extent, but not with the coronation. I think if I was doing it again right now, I probably would add not necessarily a whole chapter, but I would inflect the thing throughout a bit more with the role of the monarchy in colonialism, because that's something that's drawing increasing attention. There's an American historian, Brooke Newman, who is just about to release a book looking in detail at the role of the British monarchy, particularly in slavery, but also more broadly in colonialism. And I certainly hadn't been aware until reading some of this more recent research of just how heavily invested the family itself is, the monarchical family over generations. So, various kings and queens have been slaveholders in the Royal Africa Company, for instance, which had a monopoly on slave ownership. There's been sort of free transactions between these private companies, obviously granted royal charters by the monarchy to engage in the trade. The East India Company had a charter which was renewed every 20 years or so as well. So there's very sort of deep implication of the British monarchy in both slavery and East India Company extraction and exploitation. And it's just another demonstration, I guess, of how riven cut through like a sort of piece of rock almost, the slavery and colonialism is in the British institutions. And we've had the Church of England, recently, for example, trying to redress or address at least some of its complicity in slavery and colonialism, and starting to develop a reparations program. And I think that's quite a significant step. An institution is deeply embedded in British hierarchy as the Church of England, starting to do this work. That scares the horses for right-wing conservative deniers of the type we were talking about earlier, who would panic at things cutting so deep, let alone the monarchy, which seems to be developing as the next area of research and uncovering about this complicity. So I'll probably add a bit more about that now.
But I mean, it shows, like, I mean, so the whole coronation happened in the backdrop of, the things happen like coronavirus, economic crisis, the people's lives are, more or less serious at stake because of all those price rise, inflation, all kind of crises. And it almost like they're like rammed through on us that got to do it. And the fanfare on that. I mean, why this kind of drive is there? Is it like kind of try to validate that, no, this is good. I mean, we need to do this, but also kind of reinforce that idea that we are actually benevolent rulers in the world.
Yeah, I think there's multiple agendas at play here. First of all, talk about Charles himself. He's about the most progressive monarch we've had in terms of addressing, not just issues of climate change, but issues of colonialism too. He's gone a lot further than any of his predecessors. Opened up the archive to a Manchester PhD student, for instance, and allowing further research on exactly how complicit the monarchy has been. So as an individual, he's probably more progressive on these issues than in the past. I think that one revealing thing about what might be going on behind the scenes was this idea that all of us should join in the oath of allegiance during the ceremony. And there were initial, from what I've understood anyway from reading the press, there was an initial sort of thought that it had come from the Church of England, but the Church of England seemed to sort of shy away from that a little bit and say that the whole ceremony was planned with the Church of England, the King, and the government. And the implication seemed to be that there were elements in the government that were trying to push for this, using the coronation as another rallying point for a certain version of Britishness. And a kind of another last stand, as it were, against wokeness, against reinterpretation of the past, re-establishing what Britishness is. And I wouldn't be surprised at all. Well, no evidence for this, but I wouldn't be surprised at all if it is that right-wing faction, the Eurosceptic, nationalist, populist faction within the government who pressed hard for an oath of loyalty to be sworn, so that you could clearly distinguish who wasn't going to say it, who was the woke, who was the enemy within, who was undermining Britain, from those who, the patriotic loyalists, and the government really wants to try and represent, to say that it's representing. So I think that there's lots of different agendas. I wouldn't see it as a kind of conspiracy theory by one solid ruling elite bloc to use the coronation in a certain way. But I think there are certainly tendencies within the government who wanted to use it in that way.
But also it's like lots of like politicking as well, because by doing that, they want to make sure that they can win again.
Yeah.
Because it's a kind of validation, and also, tapping those constituencies that, royal family is actually good force. They will take care of you.
Yeah. And I think that's absolutely right. There is kind of cynical short-term electoral politics here as well. The culture war has been driven by that kind of short-term politics. It's basically the replacement for the Brexit divide that brought the Tories into power with such a big majority in 2019. And there's this group of nationalist conservative MPs calling themselves the Common Sense Group within the Conservative Party, have been quite explicit about this. How are we going to retain the red wall seats that we got from Labour last time, when the main reason that people there switched from Labour to us was because we wanted to get Brexit done? Now that Brexit's done, how are we going to retain those votes? How are we going to keep them permanently conservative, blue rather than red? Well, here's your answer: culture war. We tell all these kind of supposedly gritty northern white working class voters that we're the only ones who are standing up for your patriotic Britishness, and these anti-British elements are out to get you, to undermine your values and your lifestyle with their woke concerns about transgender rights and about environmentalism and racism and so on. So culture war becomes the kind of post-Brexit electoral strategy for the Conservative Party. At the time in 2019, they made two major promises. There was get Brexit done and there was levelling up. the idea of levelling up obviously has gone by the wayside, utterly farcical in today's economic climate. So all they've got left with is the post-Brexit culture war. And I'm sure you're right that the Coronation was seized by groups like that as a wonderful opportunity to reinforce what Britain really is, this tradition, this heritage that we need to preserve implicitly against these sort of modern woke progressive threats. And that it could help sort of consolidate that kind of red wall electoral retaining strategy. I'm sure there were some elements who believed that, yeah.
So like one of the like final questions can be how this will end then. This culture war and all those things happening. I mean, obviously, it's becoming more toxic every day, and Trump can come back as well, because it's quite a dangerous trajectory that humanity can take very soon.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And in the short term, the prospects don't look very encouraging. As you say, culture war is being waged ever more aggressively. You're seeing more and more. Well, a new book, for instance, I just saw recently, someone drew my attention to it on Twitter, which talks about African complicity in the slave trade. And that's fine. It's a topic that's worthy of academic investigation. Historians recognise that there was African complicity in the slave trade. They even recognise that it couldn't have taken place on the scale that it did without that complicity. So an honest empirical inquiry into how that operated is great. But from the blurb of this book, its sole purpose is to say, look, it was Africans, it wasn't us. It's deflection, So that kind of thing is still ongoing and gaining pace, if anything. But I think two things probably give me a bit more optimism about the slightly longer term future. I think one of them is that most social surveys tend to show that despite all the ranting and wailing and the backlash of these nationalist conservatives, broadly social views are becoming more liberal, as the Americans would say, more progressive. The anti-racism is becoming more established rather than less, and so on. So social trends seem to be going against this conservative backlash, which I'm sure in the short term fuels it even more. My other, I suppose, comfort in the longer term is that much of this right-wing populism, this nationalist conservatism, has been driven by economic turmoil, exacerbated by the pandemic, a sense of uncertainty, a sense of disorientation, upon which nationalist populists are capitalizing, not just in Britain and America, but in other countries too. And that ultimately, as the global economy kind of reestablishes and stabilizes to a certain extent, which it will do for a certain period before the next crisis, that kind of extremist fringe of politics will hopefully fade into greater insignificance again. It will never go away. It'll be there to be picked up and made resurgent according to broader political economic circumstances. But my hope is that this current wave will start to wane as global economy starts to pick up again, and these populist leaders lose their ability to appeal to the supposedly left behind.
Is there any new project you're working on right now, or?
Yeah, I keep getting distracted into sort of culture war stuff, trying to rebut the latest stuff that comes out. So I've got to try and stop that soon. I think I'm nearly at the point where I'm going to stop it. The next thing is publication of this longer review of Nigel Biggar's book. And then I've got a contract to write a textbook on the British Empire for Cambridge University Press. So I want to start, instead of rebutting what other people are saying something more positive myself and going back over my sort of 30 years of research and writing what I hope will be a helpful overview that can be used as a textbook in teaching about the British Empire in the future.
I mean, I'm not a big researcher. I'm more teaching in scholarship things. I do more other things. Like what's your like day-to-day routine as a historian researcher? Like, is there a kind of routine that I will work between 9 to 12 at a stage, and then I'll go for coffee or lunch, and then I will start again? Like, what kind of discipline you have?
It's difficult for me to answer at the moment because things have been so extraordinary with health conditions for me over the last few years. There is no routine really. I've sort of fitted in work as and when I can around various health issues. But I suppose before that, during the sort of span of my career, again, the pattern of you have blocks of consistency. I have had anyway. So, for instance, if you've got a research grant and you're pursuing the goals for that research grant, you tend to have a flurry of work in archives. So you may have weeks taken up with just getting up, having your breakfast, getting on a train, going to Kew or wherever to do your research, and then blocks at the end of that primary research period where you start reading and writing and looking at the primary sources sort of iteratively on a certain project. But then that kind of routine is punctuated by other things. So for a while, I was Deputy Pro-Vice Chancellor at the university and did very little research, just writing up notes that I'd accumulated over the years, but it was all kind of everyday firefighting, managerial stuff. So yeah, I don't think there is any one sort of consistent pattern for me at least, and I suspect for quite a few other academics as well. There are kind of periodic blocks of immersion in research, blocks when teaching takes over, teaching and scholarship. So yeah, it's difficult to describe, I think, a consistent pattern. But yeah, I try. I do work most days, much to the annoyance of my family, even on weekends, which I generally try and keep clear. I'll still check Twitter and things like that every now and then, which involves some element of work. But yeah, I try to be disciplined and keep it within certain hours anyway. Yeah.
Because, like, I mean, in terms of Twitter, I mean, I don't use much Twitter these days because I find it very stressful because, you know, people just say nasty things. I mean, and I'm really, you know, like kind of soft person, like very sensitive. And I don't like unkind people around me. You know, it really kind of destroy me, my soul. But I mean, good for you because like we need people like, I mean, even like people like Priyambara Gopal. I mean, she's quite vocal about those things. But it's an everyday struggle to fight back and then, you know, stay in that course. I mean, it's so powerful.
I think I've changed. I don't think I would have been as kind of resilient and robust as I have been on Twitter if it weren't for having gone through, you know, a period of illness and sort of putting things in perspective. But also, you know, I don't suffer from anything like the kind of personal abuse that someone like Priya does. As a kind of white, you know, man, I'm not subject to the kind of misogynistic and racist stuff that a lot of my colleagues get. In a way that makes it even more imperative that I should take on some of the responsibility of engaging in this stuff. And I guess the other sort of slightly, a slightly comforting thing about it is that occasionally I do get the sense that by engaging with interlocutors who are at first extremely hostile, you can actually, you know, change their mind a little bit. That's very, very rarely, but it has happened, and it makes me think, okay, it's worth doing, and then just trying to ignore the really personal, sort of nasty stuff in between. And yeah, I suppose it goes back to what I was saying at the beginning. I know for the vast majority, I'm not going to change anyone's minds because, you know, they're driven by other things than curiosity about history. You know, their sense of history comes from a different place, and I'm not going to be able to change that place. But where it does seem to work and where some engagement is useful, and I've also, you know, learned some things from being challenged. It's useful sometimes to have your own suppositions challenged. And it's led me to go away and read some things. And I've made a couple of mistakes, which I've owned up to as soon as they've been pointed out. So sometimes being challenged is good. But yeah, you're right that Twitter is a fairly toxic place for challenges. Often they're not challenges couched in the way that they should be.
But also, I think that, you know, if society, you know, wants change, I mean, it has to have that collective endeavor rather than individual. You know, society itself will decide what kind of future society they want. You know, if they want to deny these things for centuries, good for them. But the problem is, I mean, whether this will help, you know, because like at one point we'll have perhaps like 20% of the population are immigrant population. So when you talk about nation building, can you actually exclude 20% of your population? So what kind of society will that be? I mean, I really don't want to be part of the society.
Yeah, no, I think it's absolutely right, and you can see that change happening in issues like the National Trust. You know, the National Trust, one of the loci of this culture wars, and it is because they are trying to reflect a more diverse British society and to, you know, to wake up to the idea that our heritage involves colonized peoples out there in the empire, whose ancestors have come here, whose descendants have come here to be British, and that their stories are as much part of our stately homes as are the working classes of Britain and their relationship to the aristocracy. So trying to tell those more inclusive stories to reflect a more inclusive Britishness has been met by this rabid opposition of groups like Restore Trust, who want to censor the National Trust effectively from saying these things. And I think you're right, it's totally futile in the long run, as you're suggesting. It won't work because people do have these other experiences of being British, which that traditional story doesn't reflect. And it also just increases the animosity. It increases the divisiveness, which is what culture war as a whole relies on creating, perpetuating, and exacerbating divisions. That is the electoral strategy of people like Trump, Republicans in the US at the moment. So it does us all a massive disservice to engage in this kind of divisive culture war politics. And you just wish that they would realise that things are changing and to make change happen in positive ways.
It's like during the Iraqi invasion, so the Bush administration hired 2 scholars to know a bit more about Iraq and the Middle East. And the 2 scholars they hired, one of them is Bernard Lewis. So he's been, historically,
yeah,
more or less almost like racist, So suddenly he became expert on Iraq. The powerful don't care, They just, this is auto reflex. Okay, we want to go to Middle East. Okay, who's the expert? Bring him here.
Yeah. Who's the expert who will tell us what we want to hear?
Yeah, he will tell them, Muslim rage, Muslims are really angry with us, So it's nothing to do with us. It's them creating problems.
Yeah, that's right.
They hate us. They hate our democracy, our freedom, and all this bullshit.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and look at the damage that was caused through that intervention based on those kind of principles. Yeah,
Unbelievable. Then it's like James Mill situation, isn't it? People come back again and again, and then kind of validate that. Yeah, this is again that kind of civilizing mission. We are force for good. No, and there's no challenge. Absolutely no challenge in the time.
Yeah, that's right. And that kind of tick of appointing experts who tell you what you want to hear rather than the ones who might give you a more complicated story. You see that in the culture war here with in the backlash against the Colston statue toppling. Boris Johnson appointed a new heritage commission, and the presupposition has to be that a knowledge of colonial past is pretty essential prerequisite for anyone advising on statues to do with the colonial past, and museums and the National Trust and other bodies interpreting the colonial past. All of this was about colonialism, and yet not one single colonial historian was appointed. Instead, the main historian they appointed was Robert Toombs, who is a pro-Brexit culture warrior, professor from Cambridge, whose expertise, he's a brilliant historian of France and Britain, Anglo-French relations since the 18th century. It's nothing to do with the British Empire and with British colonialism, but because his political views were aligned with what the Heritage Commission was supposed to do and say on behalf of the Tory government, suddenly he's the expert on colonialism. It's just so cynical and so obvious.
So they do their own kind of survey study and then publish it, and then, this is groundbreaking work by these experts. And it says that there is no problem with the race here. There's no problem with anything. It's them the problem. The immigrants are the problem.
And the discourse that Black Britons are ungrateful if they criticise British colonialism, they don't appreciate its benefits and so on. It's the same kind of same kind of discourse of projection, basically.
The very personal story is you've been here for a long time, almost 25, 30 years I've been here. But it's a kind of common question against me whenever, even my former colleagues, other people, one thing they always tend to tell that when you are going back.
At least it's not the where are you from, it's the other end of the spectrum. Yeah.
So 300 years versus, when you go, I don't know.
It just, it reinforces again how entrenched this sort of notion is that Englishness and even Britishness is whiteness. which is the kind of separation. I think David Olusoga called it a firewall between Britain and the empire that it governed. The kind of the nasty bits of exploitation and so on all went on out there, and back here was a white nation. It just happened to be connected to these sort of sets of colonies, happened to derive, capital inflows and various other benefits from it. But none of that was actually Britishness. Britishness was here in the metropole. And it's really difficult to sort of change that narrative and to disassociate Britishness with whiteness. And it can only be done once you do see Britishness as an imperial phenomenon. That Britishness was shaped through these encounters, these engagements, this incorporation of British subjects who were not white. Millions and millions of British subjects who were not actually white, but nevertheless made British, whether they liked it or not. Recognizing that's what Britishness is, I think is a really difficult step for people to take, for many people to take here.
And especially like when they call us like the second generation immigrant or third generation immigrant. What the hell is this? I mean,
how many generations does it take?
I think one of the scholars said that, like, empire was actually most powerful when it was not white. Because of the colonies, they were not white, but it gave that power, isn't it?
British power came from that empire. You mentioned before about the size of the East India Company armies, and the British Indian Army was always a major component of expansion overseas. It served well beyond India, served in the First and the Second World Wars as well. So it's an incredibly powerful component of British military projection and British power, and yet sort of disavowed in the popular sort of consciousness. So I think that's an example of how integral, supposedly non-white subjects were to Britishness and the creation and projection of Britishness.
If you talk about First World War history or Second World War history, it almost like they don't exist at all, their contribution.
When they are made to exist, there's usually controversy about it, isn't there? I think, is it one of the films? I can't remember if it was Dunkirk or 1917.
There's like 1/6 soldier or something like that.
That's right, and still got complained.
Alan, thank you so much. You made time for me today. But you are one of those historians. I can talk all day.
Well, do come back if you want to. It's been a pleasure talking to you, Abdul. It's really interesting. Your take on it.
I would really come back to you because some of my own anxieties, like being from there and coming here. So it's like my intersection, someone very progressive, kind of almost Marxist, born in Bangladesh, and then my positionality here. It's like so the othering is so powerful here. I'm always the other. So I just hope that my children's life will be better. At least so that part of my podcast channel is like try to tell our story, and so that if if one or two persons can actually listen to it, that's perhaps something good we are doing here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And obviously I've never suffered from those racist microaggressions, but I think I also have some insight into why it is that many white British people don't see them, don't understand them, and when they are confronted by them, dismiss them on various grounds. I can understand where that comes from, and the absolute imperatives to start shifting some of those views and opening up insights, enabling them to open up insights. And I suppose that's one of the things that so concerns me about this turn towards populist cultural politics, is actually reversing what some aspects of positive tendencies that there were, to enable more white Britons to have those kinds of insights. And this is a backlash against precisely that kind of opening up, and because it involves my field, the area that I've researched quite a lot, I feel a bit of a responsibility to say what I can, regardless of how futile it is. But no, thank you. It's been really fascinating talking to you and getting those insights from you as well.
Thank you, Alan. And also, you'll take care of yourself.
Thanks very much. I appreciate the good wishes and the support. It means a lot.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Cheers. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.